I knew the air had shifted the second he walked into the Monday morning meeting like he owned the building. 14 years I'd been here, 14 years of knowing every regulation, every quarterly cycle, every potential pitfall that could tank us with the SEC. My record? Spotless. My audits? Bulletproof. My reputation? Solid enough that board members asked for my opinion before voting on major initiatives. I was the guy they called when things got messy. But the new director didn't want a steady hand. He wanted a spotlight, and I was apparently in his way. He was younger, louder, and clearly thought compliance was just a speed bump on the road to his own bonus. First week in, he scrapped a risk report I'd spent 3 months compiling, called it paranoid theater in front of a full conference room, got a few laughs from his little entourage too. I sat there, holding my coffee like it was the only thing keeping my hands from wrapping around his neck. I'd seen his type before, fast talker, short memory, allergic to facts that didn't fit his narrative. Now, before I go any further, 97% of you who listen to stories like this never hit the subscribe button. Which is fine, unless you enjoy watching corporate train wrecks unfold from the front row like I'm about to give you. Seriously, it keeps the lights on for the team, and trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Anyway, it started small. A subtle override of my recommendations here. A don't worry about the fine print there. He'd walk into meetings late, slam his laptop open like he was cracking a safe, and immediately announce we were going to streamline processes to impress investors. Translation: make the numbers look shinier than they actually were. I pushed back, politely at first, reminded him that every shortcut he wanted came with a paper trail, and paper trails are like landmines when you're dealing with regulatory bodies. He smiled, patted my shoulder like I was some old-timer clinging to the past, and said, "That's why we have lawyers." I didn't respond. I just noted the date, time, and exact phrasing in a file I keep for moments exactly like that. You spend enough time in compliance, you learn that half the job is preparing for the day someone thinks they're smarter than the rules. The shift was fast. Within 2 weeks, my approval sign-off on major reports was no longer necessary. Projects I'd been involved in for years suddenly bypassed my desk entirely. In department updates, he'd throw little jabs, we're moving forward without unnecessary delays, and everyone knew he meant me. I kept my face neutral, but every time he did it, I made sure to remember the way he glanced at the room afterward, checking for laughs. He needed an audience for his ego. I also noticed the interns and junior analysts suddenly avoiding eye contact when I passed. Not because they didn't like me, they'd been friendly enough before, but because they didn't want to be seen as siding with the guy who was clearly in the new director's crosshairs. I've weathered storms like this before, but the speed and brazenness here were something else. He wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless. The moment I knew this was going to get ugly came during a Thursday all-hands. He presented an updated investor outlook that showed numbers I knew for fact didn't match reality. I'd reviewed the raw data myself the week before. Actual projections were lower by at least 15%. But there he was, clicking through slides like a carnival barker, promising record-breaking quarters ahead and unprecedented investor confidence. When I caught his eye mid-presentation, he didn't look flustered. He smirked, that was the tell. That was when I knew these weren't mistakes, they were calculated. He was dressing up the company for the shareholders like a used car salesman polishing rust with cooking spray. And the worst part, a few people in the room clapped. Afterward, I went back to my office, shut the door, and stared at my monitor. 14 years of protecting this company from its own ambition. And here comes a man willing to set it on fire just to make himself look good in a quarterly report. My gut told me this was just the opening act. The real damage was coming, and if I didn't start documenting every step, I'd be buried in the ashes right alongside the company. So that's what I did. Every meeting, every memo, every conveniently updated spreadsheet, I saved them, time-stamped, backed up to an encrypted drive only I could access, not because I planned on using them, at least not yet, but because one thing compliance has taught me is this: when the match is lit, it's only a matter of time before someone asks who struck it. And I intended to be ready. It started with a line item buried in the quarterly expense breakdown, nothing flashy, nothing that would set off alarms for anyone who wasn't trained to see it. A payment to a vendor I didn't recognize, for an amount just shy of the threshold that would require board pre-approval. The kind of thing that could easily slip past if you weren't looking closely. I was looking closely. Always have. 14 years in compliance teaches you that trouble doesn't arrive waving a red flag, it hides in the quiet corners of spreadsheets. I pulled the last 2 quarters' reports for comparison. The vendor wasn't there before, but suddenly they appeared twice in the current quarter under different project codes. Odd, but not immediately damning. Could have been a legitimate new contract. Could have been sloppy bookkeeping, or it could have been exactly what it looked like, someone parking money where it wouldn't draw attention. The next day, I flagged it in our internal review system and walked it over to the director's office. He was leaning back in his chair, scrolling through his phone like we were 2 minutes away from a tea time. I explained what I'd found, pointed to the patterns, and suggested we request supporting documentation before signing off. He didn't even look at the papers. Just smirked, leaned forward, and said, "We're just streamlining for investor presentations. No one cares about the background noise as long as the big picture looks good." Then he slid the papers back across the desk, like I'd just offered him a bad lunch menu. That was the moment the suspicion in my gut turned into something heavier, an awareness that this wasn't just about cutting corners. This was about building a facade. Streamlining was corporate code for hide the parts that won't photograph well, and the man in charge was either too arrogant or too dirty to care that the foundation underneath was starting to rot. That afternoon, I had coffee with Maria from accounting, a lifer like me, sharp as they come but smart enough to keep her opinions off company email. I told her what I'd found, careful not to say too much in a public place. She didn't look surprised. "I've been seeing things too," she said quietly, stirring her coffee so slowly it was clear she was stalling. Small shifts in the ledger, deferred entries. Nothing big enough to scream fraud, but enough to make me uneasy. I sat in silence for a beat, the background hum of the cafe filling the gap. Then she looked up and locked eyes with me. "Watch your back. He's not stupid, he's just counting on everyone else being too scared to say anything." I didn't need convincing. Back at the office, I started building a private log, nothing on company systems, nothing traceable to my work email. Just a running record of every anomaly, no matter how small. Dates, amounts, project codes, the names of people who'd signed off. Patterns reveal themselves over time, and if the trend I was starting to see kept going, we weren't just looking at creative accounting. We were looking at something that, in the wrong hands, could tank not only the company but anyone who'd been in the room when those decisions were made. The thing about patterns is they have a way of growing. And this one, it was just getting started. 2 weeks later, the line between sloppy and criminal wasn't just blurred, it was gone. I was in Maria's office, reviewing the draft of the quarterly report before it went to the board. Revenue looked high, too high. I'd seen the raw data from operations, and these numbers didn't match reality unless we suddenly discovered a secret gold mine under the building. Maria looked pale. She closed the door and slid a post-it note toward me like we were in some Cold War spy exchange. On it, she'd scribbled, "Director wants plus 12% for optics. Says to fix the rest next quarter." 12%. That's not a rounding error, that's fiction dressed up in a suit. I asked her if she'd already made the changes. She hesitated, then opened a hidden folder on her desktop. Inside were two versions of the report, the original and the revised one she'd been told to send. The inflated numbers were all in investor-facing summaries, none of it tied to underlying documentation that could survive an audit. "This is fraud," I said, my voice low. She nodded but didn't meet my eyes. "I know, but it's my job if I refuse. Yours too if you push back." When I got back to my office, I didn't waste a second. I saved both versions to my encrypted personal drive. I timestamped them, along with Maria's note and the email chain requesting the updates. In compliance, the truth is only as strong as the paper trail you keep, and I was building one with steel rebar. That afternoon, I filed an internal report through the official compliance channel. Kept it professional. No accusations, just a factual comparison of the two versions and a recommendation to halt release until the discrepancies were resolved. I copied in the CFO and legal, thinking at least one of them would see the problem. The next morning, the report landed right back in my inbox. But it wasn't from the CFO or legal, it was from the director. Forwarded. No comment, no questions, just a short note. "We're aligned. Proceed." That was it. Not only was my report ignored, but it was handed straight to the man I was effectively accusing. He'd just been given proof that I was watching him and documenting every move. It hit me then. I wasn't just the annoying compliance guy slowing down his streamlining. I was now a liability. In his mind, people like me didn't get promoted or sidelined, we got removed. I sat there staring at the screen, weighing my options. I could quietly quit, walk away before the ground collapsed, and let someone else clean up the mess. Or I could stay, dig in, and make sure if this whole thing blew up, the blast radius wouldn't take me with it. The choice wasn't really a choice. I zipped my jacket pocket where my encrypted drive sat, heavier now with evidence, and told myself the same thing I'd told dozens of junior analysts over the years. If you're going to play the game, you'd better know the rules and how to write them down. Only now, I wasn't protecting the company from the outside world. I was protecting myself from the man running it. And something in me knew he'd already started planning his next move. The shift from quiet hostility to open fire was fast. One Monday morning, in a meeting about Q2 audit readiness, I raised a question about reconciling investor summaries with operational data. The director didn't even let me finish. "You're being difficult again," he said, smiling that condescending smile he used when he wanted the room on his side. "We've already aligned on the numbers. Let's not get stuck in compliance quicksand." A few chuckles floated around the table, the nervous kind from people who didn't want to be next on his list. I sat back, pen in hand, and let him think he'd won. I'd learned a long time ago that you don't have to win the room, you just have to keep the record straight. By Wednesday, HR sent me a calendar invite for a performance review. My first in over a decade. No warning, no annual cycle, just a sudden need to evaluate my fit with the new leadership structure. I almost laughed. 14 years of spotless reviews, promotions, and bonuses, and now I was under the microscope? It wasn't even subtle. The meeting was exactly what I expected. Vague feedback about collaboration and adaptability, nothing concrete. I smiled, nodded, took my copy of the notes, and mentally filed it in the evidence folder. Performance reviews weaponized by new management aren't about performance, they're about paper trails for termination. That Friday night, I called my sister. It was just supposed to be a check-in. She's younger, lives in another state, and her life's always been a revolving door of deadlines. She's a journalist, and the kind who doesn't just write fluff pieces. The kind who disappears into stories for months, surfaces with a Pulitzer nomination, and then goes quiet again until the next one grabs her. She sounded tired but sharp, the way she does when she's deep in something. I asked how work was going, and she said, knee-deep in a big WSJ piece right now, could be career-defining. She didn't elaborate, and normally I wouldn't push. But with the mess at work, my curiosity wasn't idle. So I asked, as casually as I could, does it involve companies manipulating investor reports? There was a pause, long enough that I thought the line had dropped. Then she exhaled through her nose, barely audible, but I caught it. You know I can't talk about that, that was my answer. The realization landed like a puzzle piece snapping into place. If my gut was right, her big story and my director's games weren't just in the same ballpark, they were on the same field. And if I'd been building a file to protect myself, she'd been building one to burn the whole thing down. We didn't speak of it again. I changed the subject, asked about our parents, joked about her cat's habit of walking across her keyboard during interviews. But when we hung up, my mind was already turning over the implications. I'd been playing defense, collecting evidence in case I needed it to survive. Now, I saw another path, a way to go on a fence without lifting a finger in public. From that night forward, I didn't just document for my own sake. I documented like someone else might one day need to read it aloud in a courtroom or print it above the fold in a national newspaper. The director thought I was being difficult. He had no idea how difficult things were about to get. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a building where the wiring was already smoldering. You couldn't see the flames yet, but the heat was there, rising. Every meeting, every hallway conversation, every casual directive from the director went into my growing archive. I started pulling board meeting minutes, official ones from the company portal and unofficial ones passed to me by people who trusted me enough to know I wouldn't burn them. The official versions read like PR fluff, every decision wrapped in corporate spin. The unofficial notes were where the rot showed: skipped due diligence, pressure to adjust metrics before investor calls, backroom deals that never made it into the compliance review process. Internal memos were gold. The director had a habit of firing off vague but loaded instructions, make sure the forecast lines up with our talking points, or adjust the narrative before sending to investors. He never said change the numbers outright, but anyone who's been around knows that's exactly what those phrases mean. I screen capped them all, complete with timestamps and metadata. The spreadsheets were the most damning. I'd keep side-by-side copies, one version straight from operations, another refined version for external eyes. The differences weren't minor. Entire expense categories vanished. Revenue streams doubled without new contracts to justify them. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theater, and the man writing the script was getting bolder by the week. Every few days, after my apartment was quiet and the city outside had gone to sleep, I'd transfer the latest batch to my encrypted drive. From there, I sent carefully curated packets to my sister using a secure drop we'd agreed on. No company name, no direct identifiers, just case in the file headers. But the patterns, dates, and financial structures left no doubt. Anyone in the industry could connect the dots in under a minute. While my evidence pile grew, the director's behavior toward me shifted from irritation to outright micromanagement. He'd show up at my desk twice a day, unannounced, asking for status updates on reports I wasn't even assigned to. He started CCing himself on my internal emails, adding little notes like "keep me in the loop" that read more like "I'm watching you." The absurdity peaked one morning when he stopped by holding a coffee and a sticky note that said, "Draft new compliance policy." That was it. No details, no scope, just a deliberately vague task meant to keep me spinning my wheels while he picked apart whatever I produced. When I asked for clarification, he smirked and said, "Show me you can adapt." That was the moment I realized something important. The fear was gone. Weeks earlier, I'd been careful, tentative, still weighing whether pushing back was worth the risk. Now, with every document saved and every secure transfer made, I was past the point of worrying about my job. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore, I was actively feeding a fire that, when it caught, would burn hotter than anything he could imagine. And I wasn't even breaking a sweat. Every petty power play he threw my way was another log for the blaze. Every smirk, every thinly veiled jab, every micromanaged task, it all just made me more certain that I was doing exactly what needed to be done. He thought he was cornering me. In reality, he was building the walls of his own pyre. I was just handing him the matches one at a time. It was supposed to be a routine quarterly review, a pre-board meeting alignment session where department heads walk through their numbers. But the minute the director started presenting his slide deck, I knew this was going to end badly. The charts on the screen weren't just optimistic, they were works of fiction. Revenue projections inflated by double digits, expense lines conveniently shaved down, and cash flow forecasts that looked like they'd been pulled from a motivational poster instead of our actual accounting system. I let him get 3 slides in before I spoke. My voice was calm, deliberate. These numbers don't match the operational reports submitted last week, I said, flipping to the printed copies in front of me. In fact, they differ enough that, under SEC guidelines, this could be considered materially misleading to investors. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the projector. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the vein in his temples start to throb. "Are you accusing me of lying to the board?" he snapped. "I'm pointing out that these figures do not align with documented internal data," I replied. I kept my tone flat, unshaken. This wasn't my first confrontation, but it was the first time I'd done it in front of half the leadership team. That was all it took. He shoved his chair back hard enough that it screeched against the floor. "You've been undermining me since the day I got here," he said, voice rising. "You think you're protecting the company? You're sabotaging it. You're sabotaging me." The CFO shifted uncomfortably. HR glanced between us like they were watching a car crash in slow motion. But he wasn't finished. He turned toward the door and waved over the 2 security guys who'd been loitering outside. "Get him out of here," he barked. One of them stepped forward, clearly reluctant. "Sir, is this now?" he shouted, cutting him off. I stood up slowly, stacking my papers neatly before sliding them into my briefcase. My pulse was steady. There was no rush of panic, no desperate urge to defend myself, because I knew something no one else in this room did by this time tomorrow. None of this would matter. As I reached the door, he called after me, making sure everyone heard. "We'll make sure no one in this industry hires you again." There it was, the parting shot, the public execution in the town square. A couple of people winced, a few kept their eyes glued to their notepads. I didn't turn around. Security walked me to my office, let me collect a box of personal items, photos, a few books, a small brass paperweight my father gave me when I landed the job 14 years ago. I left the company laptop on the desk, locked, knowing every keystroke on it was already backed up in places they couldn't reach. When we reached the elevator, one of the security guys muttered under his breath, "Sorry, man." I just gave him a half smile. Humiliation? Sure, on the surface. You don't get marched out in front of your colleagues without feeling the sting. But beneath that, under layers of calm and control, there was something else, satisfaction, because I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was leaving with a record, with proof, with weeks of meticulously documented evidence already sitting in a secure location, and with a sister whose newsroom was just waiting for the final piece to fall into place. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored panel. I didn't look beaten. I looked ready. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for it to spring. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, because I was waiting. My phone stayed on the nightstand, screen down, while I sat in the dark with a glass of bourbon, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement outside my apartment. The box from my office sat in the corner, unopened. It wasn't a wound to stare at, it was a trophy I hadn't earned yet. Just after 6 a.m., the phone buzzed, one message from my sister, "It's live." I didn't need a link. I opened the Wall Street Journal's homepage, and there it was. Banner headline. The company name in bold, his name in the subhead, and the word "systematic financial misrepresentation" sitting right there for the world to see. The first paragraph was surgical. No drama, no speculation, just hard facts. SEC filings, altered revenue projections, internal directives to adjust narratives. And then, in the middle of the third paragraph, the first pull quote from an internal memo, word for word from one of the documents I'd sent her. The exact one he'd thought no one would ever see again. I felt my chest tighten, not in fear, but in that rush you get when the last piece clicks into place. Every late-night transfer, every screenshot, every moment I'd swallowed my pride instead of firing back. All of it was right there, stripped of spin, unflinching in print. Scrolling further, I saw his name appear over and over, tied to direct quotes from board minutes and investor presentations. The language was damning but precise, no wiggle room, no corporate euphemisms. She even included comparisons between internal and external spreadsheets, laying out the discrepancies in clean, brutal tables. It was a compliance officer's dream and a PR department's death sentence. By 7 a.m., the story was already ricocheting across LinkedIn and Twitter. My feed lit up with shares from industry analysts, compliance officers, and even former regulators. People were tagging the SEC's official account. A few bold employees from my old company shared it with one-word captions. "Wow, unbelievable. Finally." And then came the investors. I didn't need inside info to see the reaction. Half a dozen of them made public statements within hours, each one dripping with legal threat. Words like breach of fiduciary duty and seeking remedies started appearing in press releases. Maria texted me around 8. Phones are ringing off the hook here. He's locked in his office. CFO looks like he hasn't slept in a week. I pictured it perfectly, the director pacing behind his desk, jaw tight, tie loosened, realizing for the first time that this wasn't going to blow over. That this was bigger than me, bigger than HR, bigger than his bravado. The adrenaline hit me like a second cup of coffee. For weeks, I'd carried the weight of knowing the truth but keeping it under wraps. Now it wasn't my secret anymore, it was public record. And that meant I was free from the constant calculation of what to say, what to hide, how to survive one more day in his shadow. I closed the WSJ tab, set the phone down, and finally opened that box from my office. Inside, on top of everything else, was the brass paperweight my father gave me. I set it on my desk and smiled. It wasn't just a reminder of where I'd been, it was proof that I'd left on my own terms, even if no one in that building understood it yet. The game had changed. And for the first time in months, I wasn't the one playing defense. By mid-morning, Maria's texts were coming in so fast I had to silence the notifications just to think straight. Subject line on the first one said it all. Emergency board meeting. Everyone's losing it. From her seat in accounting, she had a front-row view of the chaos. First came the assistants, darting between offices with folders clutched to their chests like they were carrying live grenades. Then the IT guys, summoned to secure systems but really just there to lock down access before more leaks could happen. By 10, the elevator was disgorging board members in rapid succession, some with ties half done, some without jackets, all wearing the same expression, damage control mode. Maria's first update was almost clinical. Director stormed in, slammed door. CFO's already here. Legal counsel right behind him. Everyone's whispering like someone just died. 5 minutes later, voices raised. Can't tell who, director's pacing. Board chair just shook his head like he wants to throw something. Then came the one that made me sit back in my chair, grinning like I'd just heard the punchline to a joke I'd been waiting weeks to tell. First question from the chair: why does the lead journalist's byline have the same last name as the man we fired yesterday? I could see it play out in my head, the stunned silence, the quick glances around the table, the slow, dawning realization that this wasn't just bad press. This was personal. This was surgical. They hadn't just been blindsided by a national newspaper. They'd been blindsided by someone they thought they'd crushed on the way out the door. Maria's feed of texts painted a picture of a room in freefall. Legal counsel leaning in to whisper directly into the chair's ear, his face tightening with every word. Board members flipping through printed copies of the article, stopping at highlighted quotes they recognized from supposedly confidential memos. The CFO rubbing his temples like if he pressed hard enough could erase the numbers from existence. Directors trying to talk over everyone, Maria sent next. Keep saying it's exaggerated. Board's not buying it. Chair asked if he can explain the missing revenue. He's dodging. I imagined his voice getting sharper, faster, desperate for control he no longer had. This wasn't his investor slide deck. This wasn't a room he could charm with inflated numbers and buzzwords. These were people staring at the very documents he'd hoped to bury, documents now in the hands of federal regulators and the national press. And me? I wasn't in that room. I didn't need to be. My presence was already there, ghost-like, woven into every quote, every spreadsheet, every side-by-side comparison in that article. They didn't have to see me to feel the damage. By the time Maria's last update came in, they've gone into closed session. Director looks like he's about to break something. I was leaning back in my chair, the city outside washed in late morning light. For months, I'd been the one reacting, dodging his moves, staying just one step ahead of whatever he had planned. Now, I was the shadow he couldn't shake, the variable in his equation he could never account for. He thought he'd written the ending when he had me walked out of the building. He didn't realize he'd just handed me the pen. The story was far from over. Maria's final text that day was only 3 words. He's suspended, effective immediately. No drawn-out deliberation, no carefully worded temporary leave. The board chair had apparently dropped the hammer before lunch, citing pending internal and external investigations. Everyone knew what that meant. He was done. By the afternoon, the news had already hit the wires. SEC inquiry launched. DOJ reviewing the matter. Words like cooperation and full compliance with authorities were plastered across the company's press statement, which read less like corporate reassurance and more like a confession wrapped in legalese. I didn't have to wonder if my sister was watching the fallout, she was fueling it. 2 days later, her follow-up piece dropped. This time, it didn't just name the fraud, it mapped it. Clean timelines, transaction chains, testimony from former and current employees, most off the record but all singing the same tune. And there it was, tucked neatly into the second section. A quote attributed to an anonymous senior compliance officer with 14 years inside the organization. Reading it, I felt that strange mix of pride and detachment. Pride because it was my work, my fingerprints on every line of evidence. Detachment because once it was in print, it belonged to the public. It was no longer a private battle. The court of opinion had convened, and the verdict was brutal. Investors began making their own noise: threats of lawsuits, demands for leadership changes, calls for the immediate return of funds. The market responded exactly as you'd expect. Stock down double digits in a day, analyst downgrades piling up like wreckage. By the end of the week, at least 3 key clients had announced they were terminating contracts in light of recent developments. Every headline carried his name. Mine never appeared in full, but people in the industry connected the dots quickly enough. My inbox started to fill, not with pity or platitudes, but with offers. Compliance directors from other firms, risk management consultancies, even a couple of federal agencies fishing for talent. The man who'd promised I'd never work in this industry again had, through sheer arrogance, branded me as someone who could take down a corrupt executive without breaking a sweat. I didn't rush to answer any of them. I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in months, maybe years, I could choose my next move without looking over my shoulder. Late one evening, I took that brass paperweight my father had given me, turned it over in my hand, and thought about the last words the director had thrown at me as security walked me out. "We'll make sure no one in this industry hires you again." The irony tasted better than any victory speech I could have given. He'd set out to bury me. Instead, he'd written me into the short list of people in this business who could be bought, bullied, or silenced. And now, anywhere I wanted to work, I could. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.